Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Bradley, and I'm your moderator this morning. It's my pleasure to have you on and participate with today's webinar. Our title today is Topics in Affordable Housing. Today, we'll be exploring issues including affordability in Indiana, increasing renter protections, discriminatory practices, and we'll also learn about some innovative practices to combat and respond to those issues today. So I would summarize by saying we're going to be addressing some of the current topics and issues in affordable housing in Indiana. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Brianka Merritt of IUPUI, Amy Nelson of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, and Matt Giffen from the City of Indianapolis. We'll introduce them later in the webinar. Before I turn over the webinar to Prosperity Indiana's Executive Director, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping items. First of all lines have been muted. If you want to ask a question, there are two ways to do so, and I encourage you to do that. You can use the raise hand icon on your screen, then we'll unmute your line and may ask you your question or questions. You can always type in your question or questions in the Q&A box, which is also located on your screen. What we'll do is that there will be a chance to ask questions at the end of each presenter, and then at the end, depending on time remaining, we'll have an open discussion with all the participants together. We do know that technology can be trying these days, especially while working from home. So if you lose your connection, you can also reconnect using the link emailed to you and rejoin at any time. Finally, if you're a Prosperity Indiana member, after today's webinar, you can find both the presentation and the recording available on our COVID-19 Hub. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Love, Prosperity Indiana's Executive Director, for some opening remarks. Jessica.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar focused on affordable housing. As mentioned today, we have experts from higher education, nonprofit, and government sectors to really dig into what the data tells us, what discrimination complaints say about the challenges Hoosiers may face, and policy solutions to consider related to the landlord-tenant relationship. And so just thank you for the work you're doing every day in your sector to support stronger communities. Thank you to our team members for pulling together this excellent panel and for the presenters' willingness to participate today. Sponsoring today's event is Fifth Third Bank, a supporter of our 2020 training series and our COVID-19 resources hub through a Strengthening Our Communities grant. This includes being a presenting sponsor for our 4-day virtual real estate development academy training being held later this month, and there are still a few spots left if you're interested. So check out our website. And then, thank you, Fifth Third, for supporting this and all of our work that you're part of and that of our members. If Jacob Brown is on, I will pitch to him. Otherwise, I will pitch back to Andrew.
It looks like we do not have Jacob with us.
All right. Well, we do thank Jacob and Fifth Thirds for sponsoring this webinar. On the next slide, for more than 30 years, Prosperity Indiana has mobilized members to create economic opportunities and improve social conditions, particularly for Hoosiers who are most disadvantaged. As the statewide cross-sector membership network of approximately 200 organizations and individuals, Prosperity Indiana's impact through members has strengthened communities and improved lives in rural, suburban, and urban areas in every county. It's our mission to build a better future for our communities by providing advocacy, leveraging resources, including providing training and consulting services, and engaging an empowered network of members to do this important work. Our members represent human services, the arts, legal aid, congregations, workforce development, real estate, health services, financial institutions, philanthropy, all levels of government, community action agencies, private and nonprofit affordable housing developers, local economic development organizations, and more. If you're not a current member, please go to prosperityindiana.org to learn more. All right, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Brianka Merritt. Dr. Merritt is founding director of the Center for Research on Inclusion and Social Policy, or CRISP, at the Indiana University Public Policy Institute, and clinical assistant professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Her work at CRISP involves working with a multidisciplinary team of analysts and students to understand the intersection of public policy and equity in Indianapolis in areas such as poverty reduction, housing, public safety, and human service provision, among others. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Merritt. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Merritt, I think you might still be muted.
Yeah, I am. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, there you go.
Excellent. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Andrew, Jessica, and all the other panelists, but primarily Prosperity Indiana, for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. As Andrew said, I'm going to talk pretty as succinctly as I can about the big topic of housing affordability in Indiana, kind of an overview of some trends that we see in the state and implications for organizations like the ones that you work in. So one big issue that I think really undergirds all of this is just even defining and clarifying what affordable housing is. I just realized you can't see my face. So let me start by talking a little bit about that. Oh, I didn't mean to not share the screen. Hold on. I will turn my webcam off. There we go. So the way I like to think about affordable housing is in two main ways. The first is what I think of as the person perspective, which is, can I actually afford to live here, whether it's an apartment or you know, a rental unit or a home? And so HUD, Housing Urban Development, defines housing as affordable if it costs no more than 30% of a household's income. So if you're wanting to purchase a home or live in a certain place, they will usually say, you know, just make sure you're not spending more than 30% of your income a month and you should be able to afford it. There are a lot of debates about what that means nationally and terms of what housing affordability actually looks like, whether 30% is actually a realistic threshold for people to afford a home. There are lots of reasons for that. It varies by city and state. So the graph on the right shows you median household income for Indiana versus Marion County in Indianapolis. And then the other two graphs show you bars or what it costs to be the median income of someone who rents. And so you can see on the left, this is primarily going to be people who don't just rent, but also probably own homes, and that there's a huge gap between what it means to be able to live generally as a homeowner and then what it means to live as a renter. So as we talk about affordability for whom, 30% for someone on the left is about $1,300, 30% for someone on the right is about $809. And then again, it varies for the state versus this county versus other counties in the state. And so, you know, what you can afford as a person making a decision varies quite a bit and can be a pretty complex decision when you're accounting for many other factors. Another issue to consider is the fact that we do have a lot of renters. So when we think about affordable housing and those costs, we have quite a few folks, particularly in Indiana. It's a little less than the US average, which is about half. Marion County is a little higher, but we do have a lot of people who rent. So when we think about that lower proportion that I showed you earlier, people who, their income being lower because they're renters, we can see that that has implications because so many people rent where we live. The other thing to consider is that we do have racial disparities in renting. So overall, like I said, for the state, we have about a third of folks who rent, but for Marion County, and I use Marion County as a gauge because it's the largest city in the state, 46% of folks rent. So overall, we're seeing differences between the state and the city, but then if you break it down by race and ethnicity, we can see that Black and Hispanic or Latino folks are substantially more likely to rent than people who identify as white. And so there are implications for having lower incomes, having the ability to make that 30% decision when we see that more folks who are likely to be in that bucket tend to be people of color. Another thing to consider about affordable housing is what I think of as the developer, the agency perspective, which is a unit affordable? And so that's a very different discussion from can I afford it versus can we create some housing that can be affordable for people? And so this is based off of something called Area Median Income, or AMI. And this is a gauge that, again, varies by city and state. So depending on how much it costs for people to live where you live, that allows people who are either developing housing or federal or local agencies who are trying to make create more available units for folks. It's based on how much people earn in your area. So that could be, you know, $40,000 somewhere, it could be $70,000 somewhere, and they base it off of those percentages. So we like to focus quite a bit on 30%, which is folks who are extremely low income. And these are people who are probably making in Indiana about 20-something thousand dollars annually. This graph shows you, though, what that actually translates to. So remember when I talked before about how people who rent have a lower household income, that's on the right. So we can see it's about $800 or so for folks. So if you're trying to pay your monthly rent, that's what it would cost you. If you are on the extremely low income side of things, you should probably be paying a lot less based on that calculation. And so again, trying to make sure what it means to create affordable housing, this is what it looks like from that vantage point versus, what folks can actually afford. One thing to consider that's really important is the availability of affordable housing. And in short, we have quite a shortage. This is not just an Indiana issue, it is a national issue as well. So, a lot of folks who rent do work minimum wage jobs. They might work more than one minimum wage job. And so the bar on the far left shows us, what it would cost, what a person should be paying if they are working a minimum wage job. So they should be paying about $300 to $400 a month. But as we know, that's not what it usually costs. Even people who are in the extremely low income category, $547 is what they should be paying. The average renter should be paying about $751. But when we look at these other types of calculations using something called fair market rent, which is based on that AMI figure I shared, you can see that those rates are substantially lower, or substantially higher per month. And so when we're thinking about where people can go, maybe they can go there, but can they afford it, even if it exists? And so we see this being a huge issue, especially for certain populations who are, say, re-entering society from being incarcerated, and other populations where, they're probably in this 377 bucket and there's just nothing there for them. To kind of hone in on that point a little bit more, there's another issue of, the fact that, again, a lot of Hoosiers rent. There's a question of what does availability mean too? So are they quality locations? Are they safe? We think about locations. Is it a high crime area? Is it an older building that might have, lead paint or other types of exposures that haven't been remediated? Do they have sufficient bedrooms for families? So even if we think about those costs, do you want to pay, $500 for a unit that's crumbling, has one bedroom, and you have 3 kids? So just because it's there and just because it's affordable doesn't mean it's good. It's also really difficult, as I'll talk about a little bit later, to get landlords and developers to participate in creating more affordable housing, especially with government-funded programs like housing choice vouchers. And we see similar things for homeownership as well. There are, again, government-funded programs or local-funded programs to create more affordable housing for certain folks, but it's usually not for people at those lowest brackets. It's really for people who are earning more income, than that. So we see these similar trends about, is it available? Can I get there? And if I can, what does that look like? So on the right, the National Low Income Housing Coalition has data that tells us about, in Indiana, the availability of affordable homes per 100 renter households. And so that's just telling us what I said before, is that the less money you earn, the less opportunities you have to find an available and affordable home. Whereas the more money you make, you just have a greater, you have more options for where you can live that would meet that threshold. And so this is not just an Indiana problem, it's a national problem as well. There's just not enough available and affordable units for folks on the lower end of the income scale. I did want to reiterate again, I talked about racial disparities in renting, but this is racial disparities in income. And so again, if we're basing things off of income, who falls into those certain buckets? We see similar problematic trends where, again, we typically look at the average, the overall income for a lot of places, which is about $50,000 to $57,000 for the whole state. But when we break it down by race or ethnicity, we see again that Black and Hispanic or Latino folks earn substantially less, with Black folks being closer to that extremely low income threshold. So if you're thinking about, can people of color find places that are affordable and available, the answer is probably no, because not only are there fewer units, there are also more people who are fitting into that category who tend to be people of color. And so we see that interplay between availability, affordability, and what is there and who that looks like to actually rent. So I wanted to wrap up with just a few considerations. Income, like I alluded to this whole time, and other cost implications are super important for homeownership as well, in addition to just rental disparities, because we talk quite a bit about, homeownership as a wealth vehicle. It's an opportunity for people to, be able to offset some costs. People say things like it's cheaper to own than rent. As a homeowner, I don't always know about that, but I do think that, how do you build wealth since so many people start off renting? A lot of people of color start off renting. How are you able to balance all those costs to aspire to something? And then there's also these generational gaps too, about also having income problems regardless of race, millennials, Gen Z, and not being able to overcome things like debt, et cetera, to get to the point of having high credit and being able to own a home. I think some of our other speakers will talk a little bit more about the role of landlords and developers and others in the housing industry, because apartments and rental units don't exist in a vacuum, and so it's so important to have that participation. And Matt might talk about this a little bit, but when we think about the rental assistance program locally, the initial data that came out for Marion County suggests that a lot of landlords didn't participate in the program that could have, and so that has tons of ripple effects for other folks who are trying to rent and live stably during this time. The role of state legislation is super crucial, as well as local and federal agency efforts. They all really have to work together to kind of create an environment for affordable housing. There's not really one single group that can do it alone. And so that also complicates how well this can go. I've mentioned before, and I really want people to continue to think about this, is what is the ideal way to define affordability? Is it based on the person, or is it based on how we're creating affordability? And I think that's, again, just the thing that happens quite a bit in housing discussions and development, and how do we move forward from there? So yes, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time, I believe. So Andrew, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Merritt. I'm looking at our questions, and I don't see any typed into chat, but if there's any of our attendees that have questions, please raise your hand and we'd be happy to turn it over to you. Otherwise, then we can move on to Amy, and we'll have more time at the end for a larger group discussion. Yeah, so far I'm not seeing any questions. So let me go ahead and introduce Amy Nelson. Amy is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. The mission of the FHCCI is to ensure equal housing opportunities by eliminating household discrimination through advocacy, enforcement, education, and outreach. The FHCCI has a service area of 24 counties in central Indiana, reaching a population over 2.5 million. The FHCCI works to prevent housing discrimination through its advocacy, education, inclusive communities, and public policy programs. It conducts investigations to uncover violations of fair housing laws and files enforcement actions to stop identified discriminatory practices, offers a diverse array of education programs to build knowledge of fair housing laws, and works to strengthen fair housing policies at the local, state, and federal levels. So I'd like to turn it over to Amy Nelson. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. What Dr. Merritt just got done speaking about really sets the table very well for us in explaining some of those income and other types of barriers for people in achieving affordable housing as part of that. And what I want to do, though, is kind of talk about now for a few minutes some of those other barriers that people may run into as part of their housing-based search. And I'm just going to do a quick check-in just to make sure to Michaela and to Andrew that you can see my screen fine.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. All right. So here's my contact information. We'll talk more, about that later in case anybody has any questions. And Andrew did a phenomenal job kind of running through who the Fair Housing Center was. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here today. But to just set some basics before we talk about where we see discrimination-related problems, is the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is the federal law that my organization typically works under, was passed in April 1968. And at that time, it made it unlawful to discriminate in any type of housing-based transaction. So that could be rental, sales, lending, zoning, insurance. If the reason for that differential treatment was due to somebody's race, color, national origin, or religion. And that's what the law protected in 1968 when it was first passed. In 1974, the act was amended to include gender as an additional protected group. And then in 1988, the act was amended, at least for the last time to date, to include families with minor children or women who are pregnant or adults attempting to secure custody of children through guardianship or adoption under what we call familial status, and then people with disabilities. And that's pretty much where our law stands today. Here in Indiana, we also have a state fair housing law, and for all intents and purposes, it's basically the same thing as federal law. There's some minor differences that aren't worth kind of our discussion time here today. You could assume that anything that's filed at the federal level could be equally filed at the state level, for instance. So that's what fair housing laws are. It's treating somebody differently in a housing-based transaction due to their membership in one of those protected groups that I've named. If the reason for the differential treatment was due to any other reason that is not protected under fair housing laws, and typically that would fall a lot of times into an area of a potential landlord-tenant law violation or no protection under any laws as part of that. So I wanted to talk about some fair housing-based data here today. So looking at housing discrimination from a national level, the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is a fair housing organization based in Washington, D.C., issues a report each year called their Fair Housing Trends Report, where they look at levels of housing discrimination across their country. In their report on 2018 data, they noted that there had been just over 31,000 reported incidents of housing discrimination, which they acknowledge was the highest number since they began doing the reports in 1995. And you might look at that 31,000 and think, well, you know, that's a pretty high number, and it's nowhere near where we think actual housing discrimination is in our country. We actually believe that there's actually about 4 million incidents of housing discrimination each year. So why is there such a discrepancy there? And that's because people may not know that they were discriminated against. It may have been hidden from them. We see this a lot in lending and sales transactions where it's what we call discrimination with a smile. And people can't recognize it because it's not blatant and in their face like it is so often on the rental side. Another reason is people may fear losing the housing that they have. Dr. Merritt, talked about this. Here in our state in particular, people are very housing unstable. And it would be the potential roof over your head if you're retaliated against for speaking up potentially, even though that's protected under fair housing laws, it still happens. And people worry about losing what housing that they might have. And then people may not know what the law actually is and whether or not it protects them in their housing search. Yet discrimination does happen. And finally, people may feel nothing's going to come of this. It was, I didn't have any witnesses. How am I going to prove that this happened and not report it then because of that? So that's why we have such a large discrepancy between what we believe are incidents of housing discrimination and actual reported incidents. At the national level, disability is the most common protected class that complaints are filed against. That changed about 10 years ago, where race had always been the most common protected class that resulted in complaint filing. About 10 or so years ago, that switched, and disability is now the most common complaint at the national level for the protected class. It's the basis of the housing discrimination. Here in Indiana, my organization earlier this year released a report on fair housing complaints that were filed in the state of Indiana. We reviewed the years 2000 to 2018, and if we end up having time, I'll give you a quick glimpse of that particular report. And we found in that time period that there had been over 3,900 filed complaints with federal, state, or local, what we call government agencies who have been deemed to be able to accept those types of complaints. And of those complaints, then there were over 4,800 allegations. So one complaint, for instance, could include both disability and race as part of it. So that's why you have more allegations than actual complaints filed. For us here in Indiana, during that time period, we found that race was the most common protected class that was filed, at 34%, and disability just under it at about almost 33%, and then gender-based complaints. However, if we looked at the most recent 5 years of data, much like national trends, disability was actually the most common complaint filed again by race, and then the protected groups really kind of mixed together after that. Andrew had mentioned that my organization conducts investigations to uncover violations of fair housing law. We do that both with individuals who contact our office to complain about a possible discriminatory practice, but we also conduct what we call systemic-based discrimination, where we don't wait for a complaint to come to us. We go out testing the market to see if discrimination has happened. So not included in the administrative data, because we tend to file mostly in federal court, is that since 2012, which is when we opened our doors here in Indiana, we have filed over 30 enforcement actions. So one enforcement action may include more than one contact to our office from different individuals about the same property or the same lender, for instance. And that has also included some cases involving lending discrimination, some exclusionary zoning, as well as most of our cases being rental-based transactions, including against public housing authorities and other forms of subsidized housing properties, in addition to the private sector properties as well. So because of our involvement then, we have been able to open up from discrimination over 33,000 housing units, as well as remove some ordinances that banned our ability to be able to pass affordable housing. And if we had more time, I would have talked with you about a case in Hamilton County related to that. And then we've also, in recent years, been doing some work when it comes to lending and redlining, which is unfortunately very alive and well. So I'm running out of time, but I will note that if you want to learn about any of our enforcement actions, you can visit our advocacy page, where we do list most of our major filings for transparency purposes and wanting to make sure that the public has a place to be able to look at the work that we are doing. So to just wrap up here in my time, I just want to offer a couple resources for people who are interested in learning more about fair housing laws, whether that's because they're in the housing industry and they want to make sure they're doing the right thing, or they're a consumer and want to make sure that they understand what their rights are under those laws. We are offering a series of free virtual trainings through February. We're doing a basics class, we're doing a class that focuses on the disability regulations, and then we're doing some topical classes. For instance, the end of this month, we have a webinar on lending discrimination, and then next month we also have a webinar on sales-based discrimination in addition to our rental classes. And then we have lots of other events that we host each year. I also talk about, we're also on YouTube, where we've created a few different videos that helps to put fair housing laws into more of a visual lens, so to speak, including our history of redlining video, which has gotten some national attention because we released that earlier this year, and then with the attention on the racial justice movement on how our neighborhoods are so segregated. That 6-minute video kind of helps, explain the government-based policies that really led to our segregated neighborhoods that still exist to this day as part of that. And then we also have lots of other publications, yard signs, posters that you can get free from our office as well. And I'd encourage you to follow us on social media. We're pretty active there. And then again, you can sign up on our events page for any events that you might want to attend as well. So with that, I think my time is over, and I will turn it back over to Andrew and Michaela.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks for all of these resources and links, just letting our attendees know that all of those will be available when we put the slides up. So if you didn't catch something, we'll make sure to give that to you. And I don't see any questions right now, but I do want to encourage folks to raise your hand or type a question in the chat if you have one. Before we move on to Matt, I did have a quick question for Amy. Something that kind of struck me from your presentation was seeing the recent rise in claims based on disability. And I was wondering if you have an idea why that's increased, if there are more violations or maybe more awareness, or is it something else?
I think it's a combination of things. One is that the disability movement in particular has been pretty active and organized, coming out of some legal challenges that related to the Americans with Disabilities Act, Olmstead, if people are familiar with that particular case, and then the later inclusion under fair housing laws. So you have centers for independent living and a number of other disability-based organizations that are very active across our country. And because of that, they've been able, to educate their consumers about protections. I also feel, though, when it comes to disability-based discrimination, that tends to be a little bit more blatant, a little bit more easy for people to identify. It's because the building is not accessible to them when they're using a wheelchair. They're told that they can't have an emotional support animal living with them at the property. So it's a little bit more easier to identify versus where we find on race and national origin discrimination, where that very often is what we call discrimination with a smile, where somebody is told, oh my gosh, I just rented my last unit. I don't have anything available. And they say that to the African-American prospective tenant, but the white prospective tenant who shows up 2 hours later is told about 3 available units. So it's hard for individuals to identify discrimination when it happens. And the same way in the lending and sales sphere, we see where individuals, rely, like all of us do, that this loan officer is most knowledgeable about what I qualify for, not knowing that they're being steered into a predatory product or not given the same information that a similar white applicant is given.
Thank you so much. That's all really interesting and helpful to know. Well, not seeing any other questions at this time, let's go ahead and turn over to Matt Giffen. Matt is the Interim Director and Legal Counsel of the Office of Public Health and Safety with the City of Indianapolis. He's been heavily involved in the city's Tenants' Rights Initiative, including legal assistance projects and anti-retaliation protections. We're really pleased and honored to have him join us here today to hear about some of the city's recent initiatives. Matt, thanks again for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen here because I have some slides as well. And let me know if you can't see those.
Oh, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm glad it came through. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me. And I appreciate hearing from Bianca and Amy as well. I am, as Andrew mentioned, involved in the city's tenants' rights work, but a lot of this is very new to me, and it's not something that the city has really had much of a toehold in previous years. So we're learning as we go. I think this is an area that does call out for a lot more attention from local government and from state government, frankly, which I'll be getting to. But I approach this with a great deal of earned humility, and I would love to follow up with both of the other presenters as well as anybody else who's on the webinar regarding ideas for what we can be doing as a city government and local officials, and any follow-up on some of the ideas and concepts I discuss here. I'm going to kind of cover 3 areas in the brief time I have. I'm going to review what we did earlier this year and how it's going so far in implementation. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that have come up, particularly with COVID-19 and state level action, and then I'm going to sketch out what I think are some areas of focus we need to be engaged in going forward. So in the background here to what we have done is, as Bianca mentioned, and as we've been seeing a lot of attention about in academic and media sources, is that Indianapolis has serious struggles with affordable housing and eviction and conditions of housing. Those are all related issues. We have a high eviction rate. We have one of the highest in the state in Marion County, and Marion County in turn has one of the highest eviction rates of a large metro area in the country. And we also have a lot of substandard housing conditions for that high proportion of Indianapolis residents who do rent, and that is related to the lack of quality affordable housing, as well as underlying economic, racial, and other equity issues. When we approached this problem as a local government in the state of Indiana, we had to reckon with severe limitations on our authority. State law is relatively weak when it comes to tenant protections. It lacks several of the statewide protections that are common around the country and even among our neighbor states, including statewide protection against landlord retaliation, the ability for tenants to withhold or place into escrow rent if basic conditions of housing aren't being met, and more stringent protections when it comes to notice to quit and security deposit laws. And because of Indiana's home rule structure, the city of Indianapolis or any other city level government in the state lacks the authority to outright contradict Indiana law and lacks the authority to do certain things that impinge on the basic structure of civil law. So you can't create new causes of action. You can't give tenants or landlords the ability to engage in private new kinds of lawsuits. That has to be at the state level. And you can't engage in a lot of different kinds of fundamental economic regulation. So in a lot of important ways, our hands are already tied at a city level, and we needed to try to be creative and think of ways that we could enact some renter protections without running afoul of those limitations. And essentially, we came up with the idea that what we can do as a city is provide as much information as possible to tenants about their existing rights, and also create some city level enforcement mechanism, particularly in the area of retaliation, which I'll get to. And I know I'm probably going to run long here, so I'm going to kind of burn through this summary of what we've already done, because I think it's familiar to some people. The first big piece of what we did this spring, with the help and advocacy of a lot of the people on this call, including Amy Nelson and others, is institute a notice of rights requirement that landlords are required to give to their tenants starting on July 1st this summer, when a lease is initiated or renewed. And the tenant needs to read and sign it, and the landlord needs to keep the record. We have done our best to kind of blast out letters and emails to who we think are landlords to let them know about this, in addition to publicizing it through our own media access. There has been quite a bit of response. We don't think coverage is going to be perfect, and that's why we're going to need to do some enforcement to make sure that there's an incentive structure in place. But I would say the rollout has been at least moderately successful so far. The other piece of the information side of things is that there is now a tenant information hotline to the Mayor's Action Center. You see the number there on the screen. That's available for tenants to call and discuss legal issues, potential legal issues with conditions of housing, and if appropriate, those tenants get referred to our Tenant Legal Assistance Project, which we've established with Indiana Legal Services. This project essentially gives people legal consultations for free, and where appropriate, connects them with more substantial legal representation in affirmative lawsuits to do with conditions of housing or other legal disputes with landlords. And the key piece of this, and I think one of the key values that it's giving to us as a city, is in the next slide, we talk about the anti-retaliation protection that we put in place, which imposes a fine of $2,500 for a first violation or $7,500 for subsequent violations on landlords who are found to have retaliated against tenants for exercising their rights. That could include seeking legal help. That could include calling the health department for an inspection. That could include calling our hotline or another hotline. So far, this is rolling out. We've got 4 or 5 potential retaliation cases in process through the city prosecutor. And we're hoping that this will, even though it's sort of an exemplary type provision rather than being able to really go after a large number of landlords, we think this may change the incentive structure for landlords, at least the worst actor landlords, and give some measure of protection to tenants for making sure that they can exercise their rights where appropriate. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges when it comes to this structure and how we move forward. These requirements are civil in nature. As I mentioned, the city does not have the ability to create a new criminal statute. It doesn't have the ability to give individuals a cause of action. So the inherent limitation there is that we can enforce it, but the money is going to the city coffers, and we lack the kind of private attorney general function that you get in the law when you create a private cause of action. We don't get to incentivize individuals to go chase after bad actors themselves with that financial incentive in place. And the second big limitation is that tenants are inherently vulnerable in this power dynamic. A lot of times they're still in the housing with this landlord that they're complaining about, and they're subject to further retaliation or further bad acts. So we need to be very careful and sensitive in how we approach enforcement to make sure that we're not potentially putting a tenant in a situation where they're digging themselves a worse hole. And another big challenge, as I think a lot of people on this call are familiar with, is the Indiana General Assembly and the general tenor of state law and state lawmakers in this area. Early this spring, there was a measure that was attached to Senate Bill 148 ultimately that would have prohibited all local level interventions in landlord-tenant law and would have created a statewide anti-retaliation provision, which may have looked good on the surface, but if you dug in a little bit, had several features that made it a step sideways at best and potentially a step back in some respects. It wouldn't have protected tenants who were behind on the rent. It actually placed the burden of proof on tenants to prove retaliation, which is contrary to what's done in most other states. And it shifts attorney's fees to tenants. So it has this sort of disincentive effect, this this notion that if you're going to sue your landlord, you better be lawyered up, you better be 99% certain you're going to win, or otherwise you're going to have to cover their attorney's fees, which is a massive disincentive to tenants who are often financially vulnerable to start with. Happily, that was vetoed by Governor Holcomb in March, right as the coronavirus hit, but it is likely that a similar type of provision will be coming in the next General Assembly session, and that's a challenge that Indianapolis, like Bloomington and other cities that are trying to be progressive in this area, inherently faces. And then the other big challenge, of course, is COVID-19. And it has complicated our ability to roll out our existing tenant protection programs, and it has created a whole new source of issues that need to be dealt with. I'm sure Bianca's familiar with, there was a Savvy report in August that projected up to 34,000 formal evictions in Marion County in 2020, an uptick that would largely be caused by the economic disruption of COVID-19. Now, admittedly, that was a worst case scenario. There were other lighter scenarios that they projected, but you have to add on top of that a large number of informal evictions that we know take place in the market and that are harder for the courts and advocates to spot sometimes. So we had to kind of shift gears to eviction protection and keeping people housed, particularly because of the inherent public health risk of people lacking housing stability right now. As I think others have mentioned, we've instituted a pretty large scale rental assistance program, which we funded up to $30 million as of late September. That's through the John Bonner Center and other community partners to try to funnel resources to landlords for the benefit of the tenants and the landlords alike. As I think it was Bianca mentioned, we have had some difficulty getting some landlords to uptake on that. The compliance rate or the sign-on rate has improved over time, and I think a lot of that initial gap was just information and communication issues that our partners were having, and making sure that landlords understood what was being asked of them to receive the money. But there certainly is some stubborn non-compliance rate there that will frustrate some of these efforts. There's also been efforts related to the eviction moratorium that the federal government put in place. As we know, there was a state moratorium that lasted through August and then expired. And at the beginning of September, very abruptly, the federal government, through the CDC, instituted a federal, what it called a moratorium, but it was in fact basically a defense to eviction for certain qualifying tenants. And we partnered with the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic to set up an online portal through which tenants can quickly verify their eligibility for this moratorium and generate an affidavit that can be sent to their landlord via email or paper mail that essentially comes with a cover letter and says, I'm protected by the CDC moratorium. You should not be taking any formal steps towards evicting me during the period of the moratorium. This is inherently a Band-Aid. It only lasts through the end of 2020, this moratorium. And unfortunately, it's going to potentially just delay a lot of pain because fees and costs and underlying debt continue to exist and accrue in the case of fees, even while this moratorium is in place. So COVID-19 has not only presented a big challenge in 2020, but we're certainly going to be dealing with the impact in 2021 as well. And I think I've already gone over, I'm going to be as brief as possible here. I think the next steps from a city level that we need to be exploring are to continue to be flexible in how we're responding to COVID-19. As I've been mentioning, we need to prioritize for the duration of the emergency our efforts to, through financial means or legal assistance, keep people housed as long as possible. We need to continue to be doing outreach to vulnerable and underserved groups in Marion County. We're working on a couple of contracts to do that kind of targeted outreach to people who may not have heard through the media or other sources about the rental assistance program. They may not have heard about the federal moratorium. We're focusing in particular on immigrants in the Hispanic Latinx community, as well as minority groups, especially on the east side of Indianapolis. And we know that Warren Township is one of the highest eviction rate townships in the county and has also suffered a disproportionate economic and public health impact from COVID-19. The second big area is we need to be promoting access to counsel. And this is a long-term effort that's going to take a lot of time and resources. As an immediate measure, we've been working with the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee and others, as well as the bar associations, to try to set up a pro bono surge of additional legal counsel for eviction defense, which will be relevant, especially in January once those eviction filings begin again. We're continuing to provide financial support to the Indiana Legal Services Eviction Avoidance Project, which is an existing eviction defense project. And our longer term goal here is to work towards the concept that there is a right to counsel when your housing is at stake. Some other jurisdictions around the country, and most notably in New York, have instituted that model. I know I'm like a broken record, but the city cannot create a right to counsel by law. What we can do is provide some financial assistance, and more importantly, coordinate financial assistance and public will and messaging towards that goal. I think it is a worthwhile principle to achieve in this city and around the state, that if your fundamental right to stay housed is at stake, you should have access to a lawyer the same way that a criminal defendant has access to a lawyer. And then finally, we need to be creative in enforcing the measures that we are allowed to enact by state law. We need to come together with other partners, including the Bureau of Neighborhood Services of the city, our partners at Indiana Legal Services, as well as the health department, to identify repeat problem landlords in the area of housing conditions and habitability, and make sure that we're using every lever we have to hold those bad landlords accountable. We need to explore potentially private rights of action in the nuisance area, so that neighbors of housing owned by problem landlords can take action into their own hands. And this is a little bit in the weeds for this discussion, but there are ways that we can try to change the small claims rules in Marion County that provide tenants more breathing space and protection in eviction actions. And I think the big piece finally is state level reform. Indiana needs, in the long term, to enact a more level playing field in the landlord tenant area, more tenant protective measures, more legal protections to redress the inherent power and information balance that exists between landlord and tenant. And these are things that I mentioned before, including rent withholding or rent escrow provision, an effective statewide anti-retaliation provision, and additional measures like a stronger notice to quit provision. And finally, we need to fight to preserve the authority of cities like Indianapolis, Bloomington, Fort Wayne, South Bend, cities both conservative and liberal, whatever their political orientation, to take action that is appropriate at the local level and meets the needs of the local community. We have some limited authority in that area right now. We need to preserve what we do have and fight against that being taken away. I don't have an additional slide with my contact information, but my email address is matt.giffin@indy.gov, and I would love to talk to anybody who was a co-presenter or any of the attendees on the call. And thanks again, Andrew, for the invite.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's really interesting information and great to hear about the proactive steps that the city's been taking on affordable housing and renter protections. I want to again encourage folks to use the raise your hand feature, and we'll pipe you right in if you want to ask your question live. Also feel free to use the chat function. We have about 10 minutes left, and I did have a question that came via our executive director, Jessica Love. And so she's asking Matt about who you modeled your program off of. How did you start the policy development process? And how did you determine which city to use as a model for some of these protections that you've given?
Well, that sort of depends on what aspect we're talking about. In terms of the notice of rights requirement, we looked at what was being done in Bloomington, Chicago, and actually St. Louis, Missouri passed a similar measure right while we were kind of working on the final draft of this. That's a fairly common measure to ensure the landlords are providing tenants a notice of rights. With respect to the anti-retaliation provision, we really looked at a lot of cities' measures, including elsewhere in the Midwest. Chicago, and I believe Cleveland was one we looked at. Anti-retaliation provisions are common at the state level. I think more than 35 states have them, and they're pretty common at the city level as well, where that's permitted by state law. So that was a case of looking at a lot of them which have similar language. A lot of them were derived from model statutes probably put forward by advocacy groups, so that they have a lot of language in common. And it's instructive to note the difference between our anti-retaliation provision and the one that was proposed at the state level. There are some similarities, but there are some key differences, as I mentioned. So the devil is in the details when it comes to that side of things. I think I and others in the administration of the city would welcome a statewide effective anti-retaliation provision, because it's a key piece of tenant protection, but it needs to be a real protection and not a fig leaf for continuing with the way things are.
Thank you for that, Matt. And a question that I'd like to pose to all of our panelists, and this is intentionally a little open-ended, however you want to address this. COVID-19 has definitely thrown everything kind of in disarray and helped reprioritize some issues. In some ways, that's raised a spotlight on some affordable housing issues, but others may have kind of pushed them under the surface. So how has COVID and the economic downturn affected affordable housing issues that you work with? So let folks jump in and respond.
Well, this is Amy with the Fair Housing Center. Anytime that the housing market gets taxed, pressure is put on it, such as what has happened with COVID, we have tended to see discrimination increase during those. So we saw it, we saw it coming out of the foreclosure crisis. We've seen it at different times when, there's been just a lot of pressure, put on the market. And what we are seeing certainly in fair housing is we have seen increases in sexual harassment cases, where we have a case that we filed earlier this year here in Indianapolis involving a landlord who propositioned a tenant for sex in exchange for rent. She had lost her job due to COVID-related issues and had notified him that she was going to struggle to pay her rent. And that was his response. We've also seen, particularly in other parts of the nation, increases when it comes to national origin-based discrimination, again, because of COVID, how COVID has been used in some ways to divide us, and a refusal to take some responsibility, as part of that, and blame other nationalities for what occurred. And we saw that a little bit here in our state, not necessarily making the news involving housing, but in some other business type transactions where people who appeared to be Asian were being targeted, certainly in some way.
Thank
I
you.
would say this
Go
is
ahead.
Bianca. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
No, I was just going to say on the research side, I think a lot more folks are really, and Andrew and I talked about this a little bit, making the connection between housing and health. It's not that it hasn't really been looked at before, but I think COVID is really exacerbating the need to dig into that more deeply, both in terms of, just the short-term need to be able to shelter in place, to work and learn from home, if that's possible for you. But, what it means to be in a house that is not, safe or habitable during, COVID-19. So I'm sure other folks talk a little bit more about, the eviction stuff and the ability to afford, given unemployment during COVID. But I think really having a serious discussion about implications for health beyond things, historically it's been, asthma and, lead-based paint and poisoning. And now being able to say like, it's not just, it's making that connection between like housing being a human rights access type issue, as well as that has implications for health in a different way. So now people are talking on the health side more about things like affordability and income in ways that they hadn't really talked about before.
Thank you. And Michaela, if you're able to advance the slide, I do want to just take this opportunity for a little bit of a shameless plug. Jessica Love earlier mentioned that we have a real estate development training academy that we still have spots for. Another place, if people are interested in how some of these issues are affected by COVID, especially on the eviction area, we have just launched a new Evicted in Indiana webinar series and book club guide that is going to go live likely later today. And so here's a site for that in case you're interested. And with just a couple of minutes left that we have remaining, I know Matt gave some great suggestions in terms of what's maybe needed at the state level to extend some of these proactive renter protections in affordable housing areas. But I wanted to throw that back also just to see if there's anything else that is needed to be able to extend these to all Hoosiers in all communities.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, this is not an area in which I would claim any expertise, but I think the supply of housing in general and affordable housing in particular is something that we as a city government need to be paying even more attention to. Obviously, that's responsive to macroeconomic trends in a way that we can't always control, but there are a lot of local policies, zoning and otherwise, financial incentives and otherwise, that we can be trying to bring to bear. And I think Indianapolis is lagging with respect to just the supply of housing as well as its other issues. And that's something we need to be focusing on that I didn't really touch on as part of my renter protection piece, but I think is also important.
Anything else from our other panelists? Any last words, anything we haven't covered yet today? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We've had 3 great panelists, a great discussion, a lot of amazing information. This webinar will be available on our COVID Hub. So once again, thanks to our 3 panelists, thanks to everybody for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.